It was supposed to be a smooth boarding process, but tension already hung in the cabin like a low fog. "There appears to be a misunderstanding, young man. I'm going to have to ask you to relocate," said Elena Brooks, the flight attendant, with a sweetness in her tone that clashed with the condescension in her eyes. "This seat is designated for one of our elite guests. I'm afraid you're not quite the expected match." Behind her, Lydia Vaughn, a poised woman in her early 50s, clad in a high-end beige pantsuit and clutching a designer handbag, stood with impatience practically radiating from her body. She tapped her silver watch repeatedly, shooting quick glances between the young black man seated in 2A and the seat she clearly believed was hers by unwritten law. "I always sit here," Lydia muttered aloud, making no effort to keep her voice down. "It's practically mine." Malik Carter, a calm-faced 17-year-old, looked up briefly, surprised but not rattled. He had followed every rule, checked in early, carried his boarding pass, and entered with Group 1. His name, Malik Carter, was printed clearly on the first-class ticket, which had been purchased weeks ago by his father, Derrick Carter, CEO of a major tech firm. He was quietly watching a documentary on his tablet, his large black headphones covering his ears, his attire casual, khaki pants and a graphic tee. Nothing about his appearance screamed corporate mogul's son, but to Malik, comfort had always trumped image. His father had drilled that into him from a young age. Never feel the need to dress to prove your worth. Heavy footsteps interrupted his thoughts as Lydia marched closer. Her blonde hair was styled into a sleek bun, and her tone was icy. "Excuse me," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Malik paused his video and took off his headphones. "Yes, ma'am. This is seat 2A. It's the one printed on my boarding pass." Lydia folded her arms and leaned in slightly. "I sit here every time I fly on this route. Are you sure you read your pass correctly? Sometimes they print them wrong, you know." She turned toward the front of the plane as if expecting backup. Just then, Elena Brooks, the head flight attendant, approached. Her expression, previously pleasant and polished, dropped into a flat frown the moment she registered the scene. "What's happening here, Ms. Vaughn?" Elena asked, speaking with unmistakable respect. Lydia gestured toward Malik, her expression sour. "He's in my seat. 2A. You know that's my usual. This has to be a mistake." Elena nodded slightly at Lydia, then turned toward Malik, the warmth draining from her face. "Sir, would you mind checking your ticket again? This section is for our elite clients only." Malik blinked, his polite smile fading. "Of course," he said evenly, reaching into his hoodie pocket and handing her the boarding pass. Elena scanned the slip, the seat and name printed clearly, Malik Carter, 2A, first class, Air. Yet she showed no sign of being reassured. Instead, she gave Malik a long once-over, as if trying to find some proof that the ticket in his hand couldn't possibly be legitimate. "Are you sure this was booked properly?" she asked in a tight voice. "First-class tickets can be quite expensive." Usually, Malik's jaw tensed. A few passengers seated nearby began turning their heads to observe. Some peered over their magazines, others subtly removed their earbuds, sensing a story unfolding. "My father booked it weeks ago," Malik answered simply. "He's a frequent flyer. I have every right to be here." Lydia let out a soft, theatrical chuckle. "Oh, come on, Elena. You know how often I fly Air. I'm not about to get into an argument with a teenager over a seat I always use." Elena gave Lydia a sympathetic look, then turned to Malik with steely firmness. "I think it would be best if you relocated to another seat so we can avoid further disruption," she said coldly. A rush of heat flooded Malik's neck. He was stunned, not by what they said, but by how little they believed he belonged. Still, his father's teachings echoed in his mind. Always stay calm. Never let their ignorance become your downfall. He took a slow breath and responded, "This is my seat. If there's a problem, maybe you should double-check your system. I'm not moving." Elena's eyes narrowed. She hadn't expected resistance. Beside her, Lydia stood rigid, casting an irritated look around as if expecting the entire cabin to rally behind her. "If you can't resolve this," she whispered loudly to Elena, "I'll have no choice but to report this up the chain." Passengers began whispering, phones subtly being raised, recording the unfolding moment. What began as a mild confrontation now felt like the edge of a storm. Elena took a half-step closer to Malik. Her voice, now colder, carried a faint threat. "I'll ask again. Will you move on your own, or do I need to call someone else to handle this?" Lydia cast a scornful glance across the cabin before leaning in toward Elena Brooks, her voice low but dripping with threat. "If you can't manage this, I'll be forced to escalate the matter. You know I have friends higher up." Elena flinched slightly, her eyes darting toward the observing passengers, many of whom had now lifted their phones, silently recording the escalating tension. She turned back to Malik Carter, her demeanor colder than before, her words clipped with finality. "I'll ask one last time. Are you going to move, or do I need to call someone with more authority to deal with this?" Malik didn't flinch. His eyes met hers, not with defiance but with calm resolve, disappointment flickering in his expression. There was no fear, only the painful recognition of how far people would go to keep someone like him in his place. A suffocating stillness swept across the first-class cabin. The luxurious space, once a symbol of comfort and privilege, now felt like a courtroom. Everyone was watching, breath held, unsure of what would come next. But Malik knew. He understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about something much deeper, the quiet battle for dignity that so many fought in silence every day. Without saying a word, Malik extended his boarding pass toward Elena once again, steady and sure. His name, Malik Carter, was printed clearly above Seat 2A, First Class. Elena stared at the ticket, her gaze lingering a little too long on the name. Something about it made her pause. The surname seemed to stir unease within her, though she quickly concealed it. She muttered under her breath, "Carter." The name left a strange echo in her tone, not quite fear, but unmistakable tension. Instead of acknowledging what she'd seen, Elena turned toward Lydia Vaughn, offering a silent, almost apologetic shrug. Lydia, sensing her advantage slipping, stepped closer and whispered to Elena with quiet calculation. "You know I'm not unreasonable," she said smoothly. "Just resolve this quickly, and I'll make sure you don't walk away empty-handed." From her handbag, Lydia pulled out a neatly folded wad of cash and slipped it discreetly into Elena's palm, so subtly it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Malik saw it. His heart sank as the truth solidified before him. This wasn't just bias. It was something far uglier. His father had spoken often of moments like this, of injustice dressed in polite uniforms and tight-lipped smiles. But this was Malik's first time seeing it firsthand, and he wasn't just watching, he was living it. Elena's expression shifted. Whatever hesitation had flickered before was now gone, replaced by a colder, more determined mask. She leaned in slightly, her voice low and sharp. "You're playing a dangerous game, young man," she hissed. "If you refuse to cooperate, I can have security remove you for causing a disruption." "Trust me, you don't want that." Malik remained seated, his back straight, his voice measured. "With respect, Ms. Brooks, I'm not causing any disruption. I have a valid ticket. I'm not moving just because someone thinks I don't look the part." There was no tremble in his voice, only clarity. Elena bit her lip, clearly thrown by his poise. She took half a step back, uncertain for the first time. Then, from the front of the cabin, a new voice broke the silence. "What seems to be the problem here, Elena?" All eyes turned toward the tall man approaching, sharp suit, square jaw, and a demeanor that demanded attention. Clark Benson, the senior cabin supervisor for Air and Air, had arrived. Clark was known throughout the company for his ability to neutralize tough situations, but also for his subtle favoritism toward elite clients. He could size someone up in a second and had little patience for complications. Elena quickly moved to him and whispered a brief summary of the situation. His gaze shifted to Malik, and in an instant his posture changed from neutral to assertive. He strode up to seat 2A, towering just slightly over Malik, invading his space with authority. "Listen, son," Clark said, voice low and edged with warning. "I don't know who you think you are, but it's my job to ensure our top-tier passengers are satisfied. If you make this harder than it needs to be, I'll be forced to act in a way neither of us will like." Malik could feel the weight of every phone lens pointed his way. He could sense the judgment, the speculation, and the hope. Hope from those who'd been there before, but never had the strength or power to say no. His hand stayed calm in his lap. His heart beat steadily. But inside, something unshakable had awakened. This moment, this pressure, wouldn't crush him. He met Clark's eyes directly and said nothing. But his silence said everything. Across the aisle, Lydia Vaughn wore a look of smug satisfaction, her eyes locked onto Malik with the certainty of someone who believed she had already won. Her arms were crossed, her expensive watch glinting under the cabin lights as if even time itself were waiting on her demands. But Malik Carter wasn't folding. Not this time. A steady warmth bloomed in his chest, not from anger, but from something far more powerful. Self-respect. He wasn't just standing up for his own dignity. He was standing for every young person who'd ever been made to feel out of place, for simply existing in the wrong seat, in the wrong clothes, or with the wrong skin color. He slowly stood, not to surrender, but to meet Clark Benson's sharp gaze head-on. His voice was calm, yet filled with quiet steel. "I'm not leaving this seat. But if you think you're making the right decision, go ahead. My father, Derrick Carter, will be very interested in hearing how you chose to handle this." For a split second, Clark's eyes flickered with recognition. The name landed like a jolt. Derrick Carter, a titan in the tech industry and one of the most influential investors in the region. Clark's posture tightened, but he masked his surprise quickly. With a sarcastic tilt of his head, Clark replied, "Derrick Carter? That rings a bell, but I'm afraid his name won't change anything in this cabin." He stepped closer, narrowing the space between them. "You can either leave quietly," he said, his voice low and cutting, "or we'll be forced to remove you." But Malik didn't budge. He stood steady, eyes unwavering, his entire body radiating resolve. His refusal echoed like thunder in the silent cabin. Passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. Some stared in disbelief. Others raised their phones to record, silently bearing witness to the confrontation that now felt like something far larger than a seating dispute. "I'm sorry," Malik said slowly, "but I haven't done anything wrong. And I'm not giving up my seat." The clarity of his words made Clark falter. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. This wasn't the response he'd expected from a teenager. Across the aisle, Lydia huffed in frustration. She glanced at her watch again, then muttered under her breath, "I don't have time for this nonsense." The tension mounting, Clark pulled a radio from his jacket pocket. His voice clipped as he addressed the cockpit. "Captain Mitchell, we have an escalating issue in first class. Your immediate assistance is required." Less than 2 minutes later, the cabin door opened and Captain Mitchell emerged. His face was serious, his stride purposeful. He was a man used to control, respected, even revered within Air, but also known for siding with the powerful. He approached Clark, who whispered the situation to him in a few quick sentences. The captain's expression barely shifted. He turned to Malik, his gaze heavy with judgment. Without reviewing the ticket or asking for details, he addressed Malik coldly. "Young man, if you continue to ignore instructions, I'll have no choice but to request airport security. I will not tolerate disruptions aboard my aircraft." Malik held the captain's gaze, silently hoping for some flicker of fairness, for someone, anyone, to see the truth. But Captain Mitchell was unmoved. "I'm not causing a disruption," Malik replied evenly. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. If you'd just check—" "No need," the captain cut him off. "You're delaying our flight. This is your final warning." A deep silence fell again. The weight of the injustice settled heavy on Malik's shoulders. But he didn't waver. He couldn't, not after coming this far. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice calm and firm. "But I'm not moving. This seat is rightfully mine." Captain Mitchell's face tightened. Without another word, he lifted his own radio and spoke curtly into it. "This is Flight 248 requesting immediate airport security assistance. We have a non-compliant passenger on board." Just minutes later, 2 uniformed officers entered the plane. Every eye in the cabin turned to them. Phones went up, flashes lit the tight space. The passengers knew they were witnessing something bigger than just policy. They were watching a young man stand against a deeply rooted wrong, and now the consequences were arriving. Phones across the cabin were lifted high, silently recording what many couldn't believe was actually happening. Some passengers whispered in stunned disapproval, others simply stared, frozen in their seats. One of the uniformed security officers stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to come with us." "Right now," he said, his tone professional but firm. Malik Carter slowly turned his head, scanning the cabin one last time. He met a few sympathetic glances, strangers silently offering support, but far more eyes watched him with cold detachment, as if he were the disruption, not the injustice itself. Lydia Vaughn stood smugly a few feet away, her lips curled in a victorious smile. It was a look that sank deep into Malik's chest, like a weight trying to crush the fire he carried inside. But even now, Malik refused to lower his head. He calmly gathered his belongings, adjusted his bag over his shoulder, and with quiet dignity walked past Clark Benson, Elena Brooks, Captain Mitchell, and Lydia, not offering them a single word, only a gaze that held pride and pain in equal measure. As he stepped off the aircraft and into the gate area, he was met with a sea of eyes, hundreds of waiting passengers, many of whom had also witnessed the incident through the plane's windows or social media whispers. Phones were pointed his way, recording. Conversations buzzed with disbelief. The injustice had already begun to ripple outward. Flanked by the 2 officers, Malik descended the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. It felt like the entire world was pushing down on his shoulders. But somewhere inside, he knew. This moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And while Malik couldn't possibly know what would come next, fate was already writing a new chapter. Somewhere across the city, in a sleek high-rise office, Derrick Carter, his father, was receiving the first of many messages. His phone screen lit up with headlines, shared videos, and a flurry of urgent texts from colleagues and friends. He watched the footage in silence, jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the image of his son being escorted off a plane. Not for breaking rules, but simply for refusing to be disrespected. This wasn't going to be brushed aside. A battle far larger than any of them had anticipated had just begun. Meanwhile, not far from where Malik had been forced off the plane, someone else had been watching just as closely, not through a lens of outrage alone, but with the trained eyes of someone who knew the power of moments like this. Sabrina Cole, a 28-year-old freelance journalist with a passion for civil rights reporting, sat in seat 4C. Her long brown hair was tied back in a low ponytail, her emerald eyes sharp and focused. She had observed every second of the exchange, from Lydia's initial entitlement to Elena's complicit behavior, to Clark and the captain's blatant indifference. And from the very beginning, Sabrina had been recording. Quietly, carefully, completely. Her phone had never wavered. Every sneer, every hesitation, every word caught with crisp, unforgiving clarity. And when Lydia slipped a folded stack of money into Elena's hand, Sabrina's heart thudded in disbelief. It lasted only a second, but her camera caught it all. She also captured Clark's veiled threats, Captain Mitchell's refusal to verify the truth, and finally Malik's steady defiance, his refusal to give up his seat, and the silent heartbreak as he walked away. As the plane finally began to empty, Sabrina stopped her recording. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fury. As someone who had covered stories of discrimination across cities, she had never seen something so clear, so public, and so raw. This wasn't hearsay. It wasn't interpretation. This was proof. A video that, if shared, could shake the very core of Air and possibly ignite something far beyond it. Sabrina didn't hesitate. She opened her laptop right there in the terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She clipped the most crucial moments, cut out the unnecessary parts, and carefully edited the timeline to tell the story as it had happened, without embellishment, but with every ounce of truth intact. Then she gave it a headline that would grab the world by the throat. Black teen forcibly removed from VIP seat after white woman bribes airline staff. She stared at the post button for a moment. This video, once live, would be out of her hands. It would travel fast, faster than she could imagine. It would stir emotion, anger, possibly lawsuits, possibly threats. But more than anything, it might spark change. She exhaled and clicked post. From that moment on, the wheels of destiny were no longer turning slowly. They were racing forward with unstoppable force. Within just 20 minutes, the video posted by Sabrina Cole had exploded online. It had already surpassed 100,000 views, with thousands of shares pouring in from across the internet. Comment sections flooded like a broken dam, filled with outrage, disbelief, and heartbreak. Some couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others knew this story all too well. Tweets and captions screamed across timelines. "It's 2024, and a kid is kicked off a plane for his skin color and clothes? Shameful. Air, this boy deserves a public apology. Now." An influencer account with millions of followers reposted the clip, amplifying the outrage. That was the spark. In less than 2 hours, the story had gone fully viral. Major news outlets picked it up, from evening broadcasts to digital headlines. Cable anchors debated it, panels dissected it, hashtags ignited. Justice for Malik surged to the #1 trending topic worldwide. Once known for its elegant service and exclusivity, Air was now being branded as a corporate face of racism, favoritism, and corruption. And in a quiet corner of an airport cafe, Sabrina Cole sat at a small table, watching her post become a social lightning bolt. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from journalists, editors, and colleagues asking for details, asking for the source. But Sabrina wasn't interested in the fame. Her mind stayed focused on one thing. Malik Carter, the young man who had kept his head high as the world tried to push him down. She took a sip of her coffee and let out a long breath. In her heart, she knew she'd done the right thing. The only thing that mattered now was that justice followed. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in a polished boardroom at Novatech Systems, a different kind of storm was erupting. Derrick Carter, CEO of Novatech and father to Malik, sat at the head of a glass conference table, deep in conversation with his executive team. A man of discipline and strategy, Derrick had built his empire from the ground up, but right now his usual focus was breaking. His phone, placed face down beside his tablet, buzzed once, then again, then in a rapid flurry. He paused the meeting and flipped it over. First came a message from his assistant. "Sir, you need to see this immediately. It's about Malik." Then came the link. Derrick tapped it, his expression unreadable. The 5-minute video began playing, and as each frame passed, the energy in the room shifted. His once composed face grew taut. At the moment when Lydia Vaughn slipped cash into Elena Brooks's hand, Derrick's jaw clenched. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes burned with a cold, fierce anger. The video ended. Silence fell over the boardroom. Without a word, Derrick pushed back from the table, rising to his feet. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, then turned to his stunned executive team. "I need to handle something," he said, voice low but unmistakably resolute. "This takes priority over everything." As Derrick left the room, his steps echoed like thunder. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a father preparing for battle. At the same time, inside the sleek headquarters of Air, chaos had taken root. In his corner office on the top floor, CEO Kenneth Sloan sat frozen. The video played on repeat across news stations on every wall-mounted screen, while his personal laptop displayed headlines that refused to stop updating. His hands trembled slightly, a rare display of vulnerability for a man who had built a career on polished speeches and high-stakes deals. At 55, Sloan was known as a strategic powerhouse, sharp-featured, articulate, and no stranger to crisis management. But this was something else. A knock on the door. One of his senior assistants stepped in, face pale, voice shaky. "Sir, we just confirmed it. The student on the plane, that was Malik Carter." Sloan looked up slowly. "The name sounds familiar," he said carefully. The assistant nodded grimly. "His father is Derrick Carter, CEO of Novatech Systems. He owns a major share in our company, one of our most powerful strategic investors. If he pulls out..." Sloan stood so suddenly his chair skidded backward. "Say that again," he demanded, though deep down he already knew. The assistant repeated, "Malik Carter is Derrick Carter's only son, and the video is everywhere." Sloan ran a hand through his hair. A cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. His pulse thundered in his ears. He whispered to himself, "Derrick Carter, of all people." The man who had saved Air from bankruptcy 2 years earlier with a massive investment, now watching the company publicly shame his only child. And Derrick Carter was infamous for his zero-tolerance policy toward unethical behavior, especially anything involving discrimination. Sloan felt a headache pounding between his temples. He turned back toward the screen, where Malik's calm, resolute face was frozen mid-frame. This wasn't just a PR crisis anymore. This was the beginning of a corporate reckoning. The tension at Air headquarters was suffocating. Kenneth Sloan, the CEO, wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting with his executive team. Less than 30 minutes later, the top brass of the company filled the boardroom, every face drawn tight with anxiety. At the end of the long mahogany table, a massive screen displayed Air's stock in real time. A sea of red, falling fast. In under an hour, the airline had lost tens of millions in market value. Every tick downward felt like a dagger. "This is a disaster," said Philip Green, the CFO. Though his voice remained steady, his eyes betrayed the panic beneath. "If we don't release an official statement immediately, we'll lose complete control of the narrative. Every second, this hemorrhages millions." Kenneth's eyes swept the room, burning with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "How did we let this happen?" he asked, voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "How did a student get treated like that? And not just any student, the son of the one man we absolutely cannot afford to offend?" Silence. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then came a hesitant voice. Natalie Chen, the head of customer service. Known for her loyalty to high-tier clients, she rarely spoke unless necessary. "Sir," she began, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't the first time something questionable has happened with our VIP policies. But this time it was caught on video. And the subject just happens to be incredibly high profile." Kenneth snapped his head toward her, eyes narrowed. "Are you saying we've allowed this kind of behavior before?" Natalie shrank slightly under his gaze. "What I mean is, we've prioritized the wrong people for too long. This time, We got caught. Kenneth's jaw tightened. The implication was damning, that their service culture had tolerated bias in the name of luxury. He took a deep breath, then stood. "Here's what we're going to do," he said with a controlled edge. "We issue a formal apology. Immediately. No spin, no PR gloss." He turned to his HR director. "Elena Brooks, Clark Benson, and Captain Mitchell are to be placed on unpaid suspension, effective now. Launch a full internal investigation and make it clear. This airline will not tolerate discrimination or corruption, no matter who it involves." The room nodded in grim agreement, but Kenneth wasn't done. "We also need to reach out to Derrick Carter directly," he continued, his tone even graver. "This isn't just a matter of image anymore. We're talking about our survival." Everyone in the room understood the weight of those words. Derrick Carter wasn't just a powerful investor. He was the man who had rescued Air from bankruptcy 2 years earlier. His $50 million investment and global partnership had put the airline back on the map. And now they had publicly humiliated his son. Kenneth returned to his private office the moment the meeting ended. Sitting behind his desk, he stared at his phone. There it was, Derrick Carter's number, already flashing on the screen. The CEO hesitated. He knew that what he was about to do wasn't just a phone call. It was a lifeline. One wrong word, one misstep, and the empire he'd spent decades building could collapse overnight. Kenneth picked up the phone, took a slow, measured breath. Then he dialed. At that same moment, across the city at the Novatech Systems Global Conference, Derrick Carter stood behind the stage curtain, preparing for the biggest public appearance of his year. He was surrounded by reporters, executives, and media cameras, all waiting to hear his keynote. The audience stretched into the thousands, but Derrick's eyes weren't on the stage. They were on his phone. Incoming call, Kenneth Sloan, Air. He stared at it for a moment, unreadable. Then, without hesitation, he declined the call and slipped the device back into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He straightened his tie, rolled his shoulders back, and stepped onto the polished wooden stage. The crowd erupted into applause, but Derrick didn't smile. He walked slowly toward the podium, his footsteps steady, deliberate, like a man carrying something heavier than any title. When the room fell quiet, he leaned into the microphone and began with a calm, even voice. "Good afternoon. I come to you not just as the CEO of Novatech Systems, but as a father." The words sent a ripple through the audience. What I'm about to say is deeply personal and not part of the originally planned speech, but I believe it's far too important to ignore. He paused, locking eyes with the crowd and with the cameras trained tightly on his every expression. "Yesterday, my son, Malik Carter, a 17-year-old student, was publicly humiliated and removed from his seat aboard a flight he had every right to be on. He was judged, dismissed, and stripped of his dignity, not because of his behavior, but because of his appearance." The auditorium was silent, every breath held. The people responsible acted not only with cruelty, but with complicity. They did not see my son as a human being. They saw someone who didn't belong. But let me be clear. He did belong, and now I will make sure this never happens again. Derrick's gaze hardened. This is no longer just about one airline. This is about the system, a system where money and bias speak louder than truth and fairness. As of today, Novatech is suspending all current and future partnerships with Air. We are also initiating a full divestment of all shares we hold in the company, effective immediately. The crowd gasped because integrity is not negotiable, and justice is not optional, because this isn't just my story. Or my son's. Derrick Carter's voice echoed across the hushed auditorium. This is a story about dignity, about fairness, about all of us. He paused at the podium, scanning the sea of faces before him. Not a sound stirred, only the quiet anticipation of a room that knew it was witnessing history in the making. His voice grew firmer, anchored in resolve. "My son, Malik Carter, is 17 years old. A child. Yesterday, he experienced something no child should ever endure: humiliation and exclusion simply because of the color of his skin, because of the arrogance and selfishness of certain individuals representing Air. He was forced to leave his seat, a seat he rightfully paid for, in front of hundreds of people. And I watched, with my own eyes, the video capturing it all. Every act of prejudice, every moment of corruption, every second of that disgrace." He took another pause, his gaze now locked on the cameras broadcasting the speech live around the globe. "I once believed in Air. I trusted this company. I invested in them because I believed they stood for excellence, for trust, for global leadership. But after what I've seen, that belief is gone." The room sat frozen. Then, with clear conviction, he delivered the final blow. As of today, Novatech Systems is terminating its $50 million strategic partnership with Air. Effective immediately, we will also begin full divestment of all shares and financial interests in the company. Novatech will never support any organization that enables racism or turns a blind eye to injustice. The words struck the world like lightning. Within minutes, Derrick's announcement began spreading like wildfire. From the United States to Europe, from Asia to Australia, headlines broke across every major network. Novatech pulls out of Air. After racism scandal. Derrick Carter declares war on injustice. Corporate giant cuts ties over discrimination. The market's reaction was instant and unforgiving. Air's stock went into free fall. Back at the airline's corporate tower, Kenneth Sloan stood paralyzed in his office, the words of Derrick Carter playing on every screen around him. He had tried to call, he had tried to get ahead of it. But now it was too late. Panic had spread like smoke through every floor of the building. The media had already started hounding them. Investors were demanding answers. And worst of all, longtime shareholders, watching Derrick Carter pull out, began to do the same. Within just a few hours, Air lost hundreds of millions in market value. The stock price had plummeted so sharply that several analysts declared it one of the fastest crashes in aviation history. Kenneth called an emergency meeting, his second in less than 24 hours. This time, the boardroom felt more like a funeral parlor. Executives sat pale and quiet, their faces marked by a growing sense of doom. Kenneth, slumped slightly in his chair, finally spoke. "This is the worst collapse we've ever faced. If we don't act immediately," he continued, voice cracking with exhaustion, "Air will not survive this." A long silence followed. Then Philip Green, the CFO, cautiously broke the stillness. "Is there any chance we can get Derrick Carter to reconsider?" Kenneth shook his head slowly, the weight of the moment hanging from his shoulders. "No," he said, almost in a whisper. "Derrick Carter doesn't speak lightly. When he says something in public, it's carved in stone." He paused, then added bitterly, "And we didn't just wrong his company. We humiliated his son." Another silence, this one sharper. Kenneth took a deep breath and stood. The only path forward is full restructuring, transparency, accountability, and a public apology, not just to the Carter family, but to every single customer who now sees us as a symbol of everything wrong with this industry. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of the tower, where Air's logo loomed large against the skyline. But in his heart, he knew. That logo no longer meant luxury. It now stood for failure, arrogance, and disgrace. Across the city, Derrick Carter watched it all unfold from the quiet of his private office. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel triumph. Only a deep, aching disappointment for a company he had once believed in, and for the countless others who had endured similar injustice in silence. But he also felt something else, a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just about Malik. It never had been. It was about every young person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Every family who had been made to feel invisible, every company that thought silence would be enough. Derrick Carter had made a choice, and he wasn't going to stop. With investors fleeing and public outrage still growing, Kenneth Sloan, CEO of Air, knew there was no more room for delay or damage control. If there was any hope of salvaging even a shred of the airline's reputation, he would have to act boldly and decisively. All eyes, media, stakeholders, and passengers alike, were now watching to see how Air would handle those directly responsible for the scandal. The very next morning, as sunlight broke over the Air headquarters, urgent notifications were sent to Elena Brooks, Clark Benson, and Captain Mitchell, summoning them to the company's executive conference room. All three had a sinking feeling. They had barely slept. The press coverage had been relentless, their faces circulating across every platform. But none of them had expected things to reach this level of severity. Elena was the first to arrive. Her once confident posture had crumbled. The warm, polished smile that once charmed elite travelers was gone, replaced by tired eyes and a visible shake in her hands. She looked like someone who had aged years overnight. Moments later, Clark Benson and Captain Mitchell entered the room. They exchanged brief, anxious glances. Both tried to appear composed, but their expressions betrayed their unease. At the head of the table sat Kenneth Sloan, flanked by Air's top executives. The mood was heavy, like a courtroom just before a verdict. No one spoke for several long minutes. Then Kenneth rose slowly from his chair, his sharp gaze cutting through the silence. "Ms. Brooks, Mr. Benson, Captain Mitchell," he began, his voice firm, even, "you are here today because your actions and inactions have brought Air to the brink of collapse. The crisis we face is not a misstep. It is a direct result of your choices, your judgment, and your disregard for this company's values." Elena opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but Kenneth raised a hand sharply. "Don't. The video evidence is undeniable. You, Ms. Brooks, accepted a bribe in exchange for mistreating an innocent passenger, a child. You allowed money to outweigh humanity." Elena's face crumbled. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She lowered her head, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. Kenneth turned toward Clark. "Mr. Benson, not only did you assist in this injustice, you escalated it. You intimidated, insulted, and attempted to silence a young man who simply wanted to sit in the seat he had every right to occupy." Clark clenched his fists under the table. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew anything he said now would only make it worse. Finally, Kenneth looked at Captain Mitchell, a veteran pilot with decades in the industry. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying a rare tone of disappointment, "I trusted your leadership, but you chose to back corruption instead of defending truth. You misused your authority to remove an innocent passenger. And for that, you failed every principle of responsibility and justice that a pilot should hold dear." The aging captain looked visibly shaken. In that moment, with his legacy unraveling before him, he seemed smaller, frailer than ever. Kenneth took a deep breath and delivered the final decision. "Effective immediately, your employment with Air is terminated. All three of you. This decision will be communicated company-wide as a clear and final message that Air will not tolerate discrimination, corruption, or the abuse of power. You will be escorted out of the building by security following this meeting." A cold silence swept the room as the three former employees gathered their things. They rose slowly, heads bowed, and exited the room under the hollow stares of the executives they once worked alongside. In that instant, each of them knew their careers were over. Across the city, in the comfort of her luxury apartment, Lydia Vaughn was sipping her morning coffee when her phone began to vibrate furiously. Annoyed, she glanced at the screen, only to find her inbox flooded with notifications from her employer. Frowning, she opened the first one. Her heart dropped. It was an official notice from her company's HR department informing her that she was being suspended indefinitely. Her alleged involvement in an act of racial discrimination and bribery had triggered a formal internal investigation. She barely had time to process the shock before another email landed in her inbox. This time, from Aaron Air. Ms. Vaughn, due to your role in the incident currently under public scrutiny, your VIP status with Aaron Air has been permanently revoked. You are no longer permitted to use any of our services. Her coffee cup slipped slightly in her hand, trembling. The woman who had once been treated like royalty by flight attendants was now officially persona non grata. Her influence? Gone. Her access? Revoked. Lydia Vaughn, who once believed money and power could buy her anything, even people's silence, was finally starting to understand that some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. And for the first time in her life, she had no control over the consequences. Lydia Vaughn's world collapsed like a house of cards. One moment, she had been lounging in her designer apartment with a steaming cup of imported coffee. The next, she was slumped on her leather sofa, hands covering her face, shaken to her core. The emails, the backlash, the bans. It all hit at once, an avalanche triggered by her own arrogance. She had believed herself untouchable. Now, the weight of her actions came crashing down. Meanwhile, across the city, Kenneth Sloan sat alone in his office at Aaron Air's headquarters, gazing blankly out the window. The skyline looked different now, no longer promising or powerful, just heavy with consequence. The silence in his office was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of reporters gathering outside. He had made the difficult decisions, the firings, the statements, the apologies. But deep down, Kenneth knew. That was just the surface. This was far from over. If Aaron Air wanted redemption, it had to go deeper. Across the city, Derrick Carter continued to monitor the unfolding drama. He remained calm, almost quiet, not out of vengeance, but conviction. He didn't celebrate the fall of individuals. He didn't take joy in careers ending or reputations crumbling. But he did feel a sense of justice. Justice that was finally beginning to take form. Yet in Derrick's mind, this was never just about punishing a few bad actors. It was about dismantling a system, one that allowed injustice to hide behind corporate policy and polished smiles. And that system he was determined to change. By the end of the day, Aaron Air's leadership received a formal letter from Derrick Carter's office. Kenneth Sloan opened it with a growing sense of dread, reading each word as if it carried the weight of a gavel. The letter was firm, professional, and non-negotiable. Effective immediately, Aaron Air must suspend all flights for 48 hours. During this time, the airline was to conduct mandatory, organization-wide anti-bias and anti-racism training, including senior executives, pilots, attendants, and ground staff. Kenneth felt his stomach drop. 2 full days of suspended operations? The financial loss would be astronomical, not to mention the public chaos it would unleash. He looked around at the executives gathered in the crisis room. Their expressions mirrored his own, stunned, frustrated, yet resigned. "This isn't a request," Kenneth finally said. "It's an order, and if we don't comply, we lose everything." The room remained silent. Then Philip Green, the CFO, exhaled slowly and nodded. "I agree," he said. "The losses will be severe, but if we refuse, we're finished." Kenneth pressed his fingers to his temple, the pressure mounting. Then, with a heavy voice full of reluctant acceptance, he issued the command. "Announce the suspension of all Aaron Air flights for the next 48 hours. We will take full responsibility to our passengers, our partners, and the world watching." As soon as the news broke, the media erupted. Every major outlet ran breaking headlines. Aaron Air Ground's entire fleet, amid racism, scandal fallout, unprecedented move, airline halts operations for anti-bias training, public fury, mounts as travelers, stranded, worldwide airports from New York to London, Singapore to Johannesburg were thrown into disarray. Thousands of passengers scrambled to rearrange travel plans. customer service lines were flooded with calls demanding compensation. Social media lit up with both outrage and cautious support. Inside Air, the phones rang nonstop. The customer service inbox was drowning in complaints. Anger, confusion, frustration. The storm had arrived. But Kenneth Sloan and his leadership team knew there was no other path forward. If they wanted to survive, they would have to weather it, fully, painfully, transparently. At the same time, Derrick Carter stepped into the media spotlight once more. Speaking calmly on a major news network, he explained the reasoning behind his unprecedented demand. "This was never about destroying Air," Derrick said. "It's about holding them, and all corporations, accountable. You cannot claim to be a global leader while enabling injustice within your walls. You cannot prioritize profit over people and expect to escape consequence." He looked directly into the camera as if addressing every CEO in the country. "If we want a better future, we must build it from within, with education, accountability, and the courage to admit we've been wrong." The interview went viral. Human rights organizations praised the move. Influencers and advocates rallied behind Derrick's call for systemic reform. The message was clear. Justice isn't a press release. It's a transformation. Derrick Carter's public statement sent ripples far and wide. He made it clear. His mission was never to destroy Air, but to force it to confront a deep, long-standing problem within its culture. A problem that had allowed discrimination to hide behind first-class curtains and corporate policies. His words resonated beyond business. Human rights organizations praised the bold step. The online community, previously outraged, now rallied behind the idea that reform was possible, if accountability came first. "We cannot accept any form of racism or bias, anywhere," Derrick said on national television. "Only when individuals and organizations take full responsibility can society begin to heal and move forward." Back inside Air, the mandated 48-hour flight suspension became the most intense period in the company's history. The terminals were silent. No planes took off, no passengers boarded. Instead, every Air employee, from pilots to baggage handlers, from gate agents to senior executives, was immersed in full-scale anti-bias and anti-racism training, led by professionals from Novatech Systems, Derrick's own company. The training was not surface level. It was raw, eye-opening, and emotionally charged. Staff were shown real stories and testimonies, not just from the Malik Carter incident, but from others who had faced subtle discrimination over the years. They watched, listened, and for many, truly understood for the first time the damage that silence, complicity, and unconscious bias could cause. Even Kenneth Sloan, the CEO, attended each session without exception. He sat quietly, listening not as a leader, but as a student. Each word Malik had spoken, each injustice replayed in the footage, stayed with him. For the first time in his long, decorated career, he wasn't focused on profit margins or shareholder meetings. He was thinking about people. By the end of the 2-day suspension, Air resumed operations, but not as the same airline. That chapter had closed. At a live press conference, Kenneth stood before the media and addressed the world with sincerity. "We failed. We know that. But we are committed, not just in words but in action, to becoming a company that truly values every individual. We will monitor ourselves, we will hold each other accountable, and we will never again allow injustice to hide behind our brand." But despite the promises and new policies, the path ahead was steep. The company's reputation was still badly bruised. Public trust remained fragile. Financial losses from the suspension and investor withdrawals would take months, maybe years, to recover from. And yet, Derrick Carter, watching quietly from afar, did not feel satisfaction. He felt resolve. Sometimes it takes loss, painful, public, undeniable, for a system to truly awaken. And Derrick knew this was just the beginning. As the final hours of the training program drew to a close, an internal memo was sent to every Air employee. There would be one final session in the main conference hall. A special talk, delivered by the very person whose story had sparked a global reckoning, Malik Carter. The morning of the event, employees from every department gathered inside the vast hall. The energy was tense, uncertain. For many, this would be their first time seeing Malik in person. Even senior leaders, including Kenneth Sloan, arrived early and sat in the front rows. Their expressions were solemn, introspective. At precisely 9 a.m., the doors opened and Malik Carter walked in. The room fell utterly silent. He was dressed simply, a crisp white shirt and jeans. His presence was calm, his posture upright, not proud, not defensive, just present. He stepped onto the stage and walked to the podium, a soft nod to the audience. Then, in a voice both clear and humble, he began. "Good morning. I'm sure most of you know who I am and why I'm here." A long pause. The weight of the moment settled around them. Before all this happened, I never imagined I'd stand in front of so many people, in a room like this, talking about what I went through. But here I am, not because I want to relive the pain, but because I hope none of you ever let it happen again. To anyone. Malik began to recount what had happened that day on the plane, not as a viral headline, but from his own perspective. His voice was steady, but full of emotion. He described the confusion, the shame, the weight of being judged, not for what he did, but for how he looked. When Ms. Brooks looked at me like I didn't belong, when Mr. Benson told me I'd be removed, when Captain Mitchell sided with them without hearing me out. I felt invisible. His voice softened, but his words pierced through the silence. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity, about being seen and heard like anyone else. The room remained silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Even Kenneth Sloan lowered his gaze, listening with the intensity of someone finally understanding. "I'm not here to blame," Malik said, his tone sincere. "I'm here to ask you to do better. All of us can do better. Sometimes all it takes is one person choosing to speak up, instead of looking away." Malik finished with a line that hung in the air like a sacred vow. "My dad always says, the mistakes we make don't define us. But how we face them, how we fix them, does." He nodded once more, then stepped away from the podium. Soft applause began from the back of the hall. It grew louder, deeper, until the entire room rose to their feet in a standing ovation, not just for a speech, but for the courage of a young man who had endured more than most could imagine, and still chose to forgive. The room was still. Malik Carter's voice, filled with heartbreak and strength, hung in the air like a fragile thread, connecting every person in the hall to a truth they could no longer ignore. "What hurt me the most," Malik had said, "was realizing that people like me, young black men, are still seen as less, as unworthy, even when we've done nothing wrong." Some lowered their heads, others blinked away tears. Many who had once seen the entire situation as a PR issue now truly understood. This wasn't about optics. It was about humanity. Malik's voice didn't accuse. It awakened. Even the smallest gesture, a glance, a dismissive tone, can tear someone down, he continued. We all need to take a moment and ask ourselves if we're adding to the harm or helping heal it. In the front row, Kenneth Sloan sat completely still, his jaw tight, his eyes wet. Each word from Malik landed like a blow to the chest, not because it was an attack, but because it revealed the truth about the culture he had allowed to fester under his leadership. When Malik reached the end of his talk, he left the room with a quiet dignity. "My father always told me," Malik said, "what defines us isn't the mistakes we make, but how we respond to them. I believe Air can change, not for image, not for profits, but because it's simply the right thing to do." He bowed slightly, then turned and walked off stage. At first the room was silent, then a single clap echoed. It grew, slowly at first, until the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause, not out of formality, but from genuine respect. Malik Carter had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had changed the very soul of a corporation. As Kenneth Sloan watched Malik walk away, something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Admiration. True, unfiltered admiration for a young man who had shown more grace and strength than many adults in his boardroom ever had. Turning to his colleagues, Kenneth finally spoke. "That was the most important lesson I've had in my entire career," he said quietly. "From this day forward, we don't just change policies. We change the culture. We change ourselves." One by one, the other leaders nodded. The room had changed, and so had they. Meanwhile, across the city, the impact of that same truth was settling heavily on others. In a dim apartment that once glowed with modern comfort, Clark Benson woke up to a space that now felt cold and empty. He hadn't slept well. Again. The once proud supervisor who used to stride confidently through terminals now sat at his kitchen table, staring at a stack of rejection emails. He had applied to dozens of airlines, major carriers, small regional ones, even international companies. Every single reply was the same: polite rejection or complete silence. "We regret to inform you that your application does not meet our hiring criteria." Clark didn't need anyone to spell it out for him. He knew what the real reason was. The scandal had burned his name into the industry's memory. No airline wanted to be associated with someone known for bullying a teenager out of a first-class seat. His job was gone. But worse, his integrity was gone with it. He leaned forward, resting his head in his hands, haunted by the image of Malik's eyes, calm yet disappointed. It wasn't just his reputation he had lost. It was his sense of self. In the quiet of a small apartment cluttered with overdue bills and unopened envelopes, Clark Benson sat slumped in a chair, staring at nothing. 10 years. That's how long it had taken him to build a career in the aviation industry. 10 years of climbing the ladder, learning procedures, managing teams, all gone in an instant. His name had become untouchable. A single scandal was enough to erase everything. He didn't need to read another rejection email to know what they all said. "Thank you for your interest, but..." The real message? "You're done." Clark ran a hand over his face, the weight of his choices bearing down on him. He had always seen himself as firm, not cruel, structured, not arrogant. But now, with everything stripped away, he finally saw what others had long seen in him. A man who believed power made him right. A man who had let prejudice mask itself as protocol. He leaned forward, head in his hands. For the first time in years, he questioned who he had become. In a much smaller apartment across town, Elena Brooks sat alone in front of a flickering computer screen. Another rejection. Her inbox was filled with them, some direct, some vague. It didn't matter. The result was the same. No one wanted to hire her. Once a top-tier flight attendant, Elena had taken pride in being hand-picked for VIP routes, praised for her grace and attentiveness. She had been popular among elite flyers, respected, even admired. But now even her old colleagues wouldn't answer her calls. Her name was whispered with shame, associated not with professionalism, but with complicity. And worst of all, she couldn't argue with them. When the injustice unfolded before her, she had chosen silence, and that silence had cost her everything. Not far away, Captain Mitchell sat in the dim living room of his once proud home. He looked down at the old framed photo in his hands, himself in full uniform, smiling in the cockpit, surrounded by young trainees. It had once represented honor, legacy. Now it felt like a lie. For over 30 years, Mitchell had flown across oceans and continents. He had trained dozens of pilots, been trusted with thousands of lives. And yet, when it truly mattered, when the moment came to stand for something right, he had failed. No airline would even consider him now. His license still valid, but his reputation irrevocably tarnished. Even his own sense of identity had been grounded. He sat in silence, haunted by Malik's steady gaze, and the shame of choosing silence over integrity. Meanwhile, in a part of the city once pulsing with power and influence, Lydia Vaughn sat on her pristine, cream-colored sofa, wrapped in silence. For the first time in her life, the world had turned its back on her. The phone no longer buzzed with invitations. The friends who once vied for her attention now ghosted her. Her employer had suspended her indefinitely. Her name had become a stain her company no longer wished to be associated with. The woman who once believed her wealth could bend rules and people was now a symbol of disgrace. She looked out the window, but the city no longer looked like hers. Where there was once admiration in others' eyes, now there was disdain. Where there was once reverence, now there was isolation. Her world, once adorned with luxury and entitlement, now felt colder than ever. For the first time, Lydia Vaughn felt what it was to be invisible, not because of someone else's bias, but because of her own actions. Back at Novatech Systems, Derrick Carter sat quietly at his desk. The fallout of the scandal was still echoing across headlines and social media, but his mind wasn't focused on the collapse of reputations. He was thinking about what came next. He didn't feel joy in their downfall, only the heavy weight of necessary justice. For true change to happen, people had to feel the cost of what they had ignored or enabled. And now they were. But that alone wasn't enough. Derrick closed his laptop and sat in silence, watching the city from his window. He knew this journey was far from over. Changing policies was one thing. Changing hearts would take far more work. But one step had been taken, a painful, public, transformative step. And from here, the fight for fairness would only continue. While Clark Benson, Elena Brooks, and Captain Mitchell grappled with isolation, their careers in ruins and their reputations scorched, Derrick Carter was quietly watching. He had never intended for their downfall to be the final chapter. Derrick believed justice wasn't just about consequences. It was also about transformation. He understood something most people overlooked. Real change couldn't be forced through shame alone. People needed to understand the harm they caused, feel it, and then be given a path forward to make things right. And so, from that quiet, reflective place, he launched something unexpected, something bold. He called it Second Path. A humanitarian initiative built on one core belief. Those who had caused harm through prejudice deserved an opportunity to reform, but only if they were truly willing to confront their mistakes. News of Second Path spread fast. Headlines shifted from outrage to curiosity. Critics were surprised. Supporters were inspired. Even some of the fiercest voices online softened in response to Derrick's gesture. Could redemption really be part of justice? When Clark Benson received the letter inviting him to participate, he sat in stunned silence. He didn't think he deserved a second chance. Guilt still clung to him like smoke, and pride, now broken, made him hesitate. But deep inside, a flicker of something stirred. Hope? No, not hope. A chance? Clark took a breath and signed up. On the first day of the Second Path program, Clark entered a simple, quiet room. No uniforms, no titles. Just plain chairs, white walls, and a circle of faces, each one marked by regret. He took a seat near the back, avoiding eye contact. In the corner, Elena Brooks sat with folded hands and hollow eyes. The once confident flight attendant now looked small, but present. Her silence wasn't cold, it was full of anxiety and inner conflict. A few seats away sat Captain Mitchell, the most senior in the room. He had flown across continents, trained countless young pilots, but here his shoulders sagged with the weight of disgrace. He didn't speak, but his presence said everything. I am ready to listen. The program didn't open with lectures. There were no slogans, no public apologies, no social media statements. Instead, the room welcomed truth, unfiltered and uncomfortable. Facilitators invited participants to speak about their mistakes, not to justify them, but to unpack them. They shared stories of those harmed by bias. They showed footage. They talked about systems, not just individual moments, that allow prejudice to survive. At first, most in the room stayed silent. Then one day, Derrick Carter walked in. There was a sudden stillness. Even Clark, Elena, and Captain Mitchell straightened slightly. The man who had exposed them now stood calmly before them. But Derrick didn't glare. He didn't scold. He smiled, gently, sincerely. "You're all here because you made mistakes," he began. "So have I. We all have. The difference is whether we're brave enough to face them." His voice was steady, compassionate, but firm. "I didn't create Second Path to make you forget what you did," he continued. "I created it so you remember it deeply, enough to never repeat it, enough to teach others, enough to become better than you were." His eyes fell on Clark. "You demeaned my son, not just with words, but with power." Then to Elena, "You watched and said nothing, even when your heart knew it was wrong." And finally, to Captain Mitchell, "You had the authority to stop it. But you chose silence." No one responded. They didn't need to. Their faces, pained, humbled, said enough. Derrick's voice softened. "But if you're here, and if you're willing to change, then I am willing to believe in that change. What matters most isn't how badly we fall. What matters is how we rise." For the first time since the incident, Clark Benson felt something crack inside him. Not anger, not shame. Clarity. It was the moment he realized he wasn't being punished anymore. He was being invited to transform. In the corner, Elena Brooks wiped away tears. Every night since that flight she had replayed her silence. She had justified it, told herself she was just doing her job. But in that room, with Derrick standing before her, she finally accepted the truth. Her silence had made her complicit. And now, for the first time, she felt ready to speak. At the back of the room, Captain Mitchell remained silent. But inside him, something shifted. He had once believed that his uniform gave him the right to make decisions without question. Now he understood that leadership wasn't just about control. It was about courage, especially the kind that speaks up when no one else will. Mitchell wasn't ready to talk yet, but he was listening, and that was enough. The Second Path program had now been running for several weeks. It was no longer just a room of guilt and silence. It had transformed into a place of truth, vulnerability, and raw humanity. Slowly but surely, the participants, Clark Benson, Elena Brooks, and Captain Mitchell, began to peel away the layers of denial they had long hidden behind. Through open dialogue and shared stories, each of them came to see not just what they had done, but the deep, lasting wounds their actions had left on others, especially on Malik Carter, the young man whose quiet dignity had exposed their prejudice to the world. By the end of the program, all three had reached a turning point. They didn't just understand what they had done. They now understood why it could never be repeated. And they were ready, at last, to say the words they had kept buried inside. During one of the final group sessions, Clark Benson was the first to stand. The room was quiet, the air still. He took a slow breath, then looked up and met the eyes of his fellow participants. "I grew up in a home where prejudice was dressed up as tradition," he said quietly. "My father always told me people had their place, and that some folks just didn't belong in certain spaces." He paused, his voice trembling. "I never questioned it. I let it shape me. I let it make me blind." Clark swallowed hard, emotions tightening in his chest. "When I saw Malik sitting in that first-class seat, I didn't see a kid with a valid ticket. I saw someone who didn't belong. And so I tried to remove him, not just from that seat, but from a place of dignity." His voice cracked, and in doing that, I lost my own. He looked down for a moment, collecting himself. "I'm not here today asking for forgiveness. I'm here to say I was wrong. Deeply. shamefully wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that those old beliefs no longer live inside me. There was a heavy silence in the room, but it wasn't empty. It was full of respect because Clark hadn't just confessed. He had finally confronted the truth about himself. Across the room, Elena Brooks sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel her heart pounding as the facilitator gently nodded to her. She stood slowly. Her voice was soft at first, but grew steadier with every word. That day on the flight, I watched everything happen, and I did nothing. She looked down, ashamed. At the time, I told myself it wasn't my place, that I was just following protocol, that speaking up would make things worse for me. Elena paused, blinking back tears. But I was wrong. My silence wasn't neutral. It was an act of harm. She turned her eyes toward Derrick Carter, who sat quietly at the edge of the room, listening closely. "Mr. Carter, I know I let your son be humiliated in front of hundreds of people. I stood by while others treated him like he didn't belong." Her voice shook, and I didn't stop them. I didn't speak up, and that failure will follow me forever. Then, with renewed strength, she said, "But I promise you this. From now on, I will never again let fear or comfort silence me. I will speak up, even if it costs me everything." The room stayed still, but the energy had changed. Elena wasn't just sorry. She was ready to be someone new, someone braver, someone better. As the final testimonies neared their close, inside the Second Path classroom, all eyes slowly turned toward Captain Mitchell, the man whose silence had once carried more weight than words. For weeks he had listened quietly to the others. Now his moment had arrived. He rose slowly, age and regret etched across his face. His once commanding posture softened under the weight of reflection. "I've spent most of my life chasing altitude, in both skies and status," he began, his voice low, rough with emotion. "I was proud to be chief pilot, proud of the trust that role carried. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the very values that role was supposed to represent." His gaze moved gently across the room, resting on Derrick Carter. "On that day, when I was asked to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right, I failed. I chose status over principle, authority over empathy, and in doing so, I betrayed everything I once stood for." The room held its breath as Captain Mitchell steadied himself. "To you, Mr. Carter, and to your son Malik, I offer my deepest apology. I can't take back what I did, but I can promise you this. I will dedicate the rest of my life to making sure no young person in aviation forgets what integrity truly means. I will teach them that a uniform without a conscience is nothing more than a costume." Silence followed. Then Derrick Carter stood. He looked directly at the three, Clark, Elena, Mitchell, his voice steady and resolute. "Thank you for your honesty. Real change doesn't start with policy. It starts with courage, the kind it takes to look inward and tell the truth about who we've been. The path ahead will be difficult, but if you continue walking it with this kind of heart, I believe each of you can become part of the solution, not just a shadow of the problem." And with that, the final meeting of Second Path concluded. The three former employees walked out of the room, not as the disgraced figures they once were, but as individuals who had begun the long, hard climb back toward humanity. 6 months later, a rebirth in the sky. Half a year had passed since the discrimination scandal rocked Stratus Air, threatening to bring the entire airline to its knees. Now a different kind of energy flowed through its terminals. The cold, elitist aura that once dominated the check-in counters and VIP lounges had been replaced with genuine warmth. Smiles were no longer mechanical. Every passenger, regardless of status or appearance, was greeted with respect. Veteran flyers noticed it instantly. The culture had shifted. From the boarding gates to executive offices, Stratus Air was no longer a place where status determined dignity. It had become a company where equality was the norm, not the exception. This radical transformation didn't happen overnight, nor by accident. Following the crisis, CEO Edward Langston had spearheaded a full organizational overhaul, guided closely by insights from Derrick Carter and his team at Carter Solutions. They invested millions into anti-bias education, overhauled their hiring systems, and implemented a zero-tolerance policy for prejudice at all levels. The airline even opened its doors to third-party auditors, inviting them to evaluate operations, company culture, and frontline behaviors. The results? Remarkable. The official audit report released by the International Aviation Ethics Board praised Stratasair for what it called one of the most transparent and effective reform campaigns in modern aviation history. Media outlets ran headlines like, "From Crisis to Conscience. How Stratasair Took Flight Again. No More VIP Only. An Airline's Journey to Equality." Inspired by one teen's stand, a whole industry begins to shift. What was once a cautionary tale had now become a model of redemption. News of Stratasair's transformation spread across continents like wildfire. What had once been the symbol of unchecked bias was now recognized as a pioneer of ethical reform in global aviation. Airlines large and small began revisiting their own internal practices, inspired by what one company and one teenager had managed to awaken. To mark this global movement, an international summit on ethics and equity in aviation was organized in Geneva. Thousands of senior executives, social activists, and thought leaders gathered, representing some of the world's most prestigious airlines and civil rights organizations. On the main stage, two unexpected figures stood side by side, once bitterly opposed, now united by purpose. Edward Langston, CEO of Stratasair, and Derrick Carter, founder of Carter Solutions. Langston spoke first. "We made unforgivable mistakes," he said with humility. "But it was those very mistakes that forced us to confront who we were, and more importantly, who we wanted to become. What we learned," he continued, "is that reform isn't about protecting your brand. It's about protecting your people. Every single one." As the crowd applauded, Derrick Carter stepped forward. He no longer needed to speak from a place of anger. Now he spoke with purpose. Stratasair could have collapsed, he said. Instead, it chose the harder path, to own its faults, embrace change, and earn back trust. That kind of transformation is what true leadership looks like. He turned toward Langston and extended a hand. The two men shook hands on stage, and the moment was captured by cameras around the world. A symbol of forgiveness, growth, and what's possible when accountability meets action. Following the summit, public trust in Stratasair surged. Former critics, including human rights watchdogs and community leaders, now praised the airline's commitment to real change. New customers flooded in. Strategic partnerships were renewed. Social media buzzed with headlines. From Crisis to Catalyst, How One Airline Rewrote the Rules. Malik Carter's story is changing corporate culture. Worldwide. Forgiveness with action, a new model for reform. But for Derrick Carter, the real victory wasn't in numbers or profits. It was in seeing Clark Benson teaching ethics at a community college, helping the next generation of service professionals understand what true respect looks like. It was watching Elena Brooks working passionately at a nonprofit that fought against racial injustice in the workplace. No longer silent, but now a fierce advocate for those without a voice. And it was knowing that Captain Mitchell had returned not to the skies, but to training centers, mentoring young pilots on leadership, responsibility, and humility. These were not just public gestures. They were proof of transformation. On a bright spring morning, Malik Carter stood behind the podium at a national human rights conference. The room was packed. Journalists, activists, students, and business leaders all leaned in to listen. Malik, now 18, wore a simple gray blazer and spoke with the calm strength of someone who had weathered a storm and emerged wiser. "Hello, everyone. My name is Malik Carter. Some of you know me because of something that happened on a plane 6 months ago." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I never asked to be in that story. I was just trying to get to where I was going, like anyone else. But that day taught me something I'll never forget, that dignity isn't something anyone can give you. It's something you have to stand up for, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then." The room fell into powerful silence. My dad taught me that justice isn't about revenge, it's about restoration, and forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to give people a chance to grow. He looked toward the front row where Derrick Carter sat, his eyes shining with pride. Malik continued, "I chose not to carry hate. I chose to carry hope. And because of that, something incredible happened, not just for me, but for people I'll never meet. If one voice, one moment, can spark change, imagine what we can do together." As he stepped away from the podium, the audience erupted in a standing ovation. "I never thought I'd become the main character in a story about injustice and bias," Malik Carter began, standing tall beneath the spotlight of the packed auditorium. "But it became something much bigger, a story about the power of change, and above all, forgiveness." His voice was calm, yet heavy with emotion as he looked out into the audience. Journalists, students, human rights advocates, they all sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the 18-year-old whose quiet courage had awakened a global movement. When I was removed from my seat on a Stratus Air flight just because of my skin color, I felt helpless, ashamed, hurt. But today, he paused. "I don't want to talk about that pain. I want to talk about what I've learned, what my father, Derrick Carter, has taught me over these months." As Malik continued, his voice became firmer, stronger. "My father always said, true justice isn't about punishment. It's about redemption. It's when people recognize the harm they've caused and work tirelessly to make it right. And that's what forgiveness really is. Not forgetting, but giving others the chance to rewrite their story." His gaze drifted across the front rows, pausing on 3 familiar faces: Clark Benson, Elena Brooks, and Captain Mitchell. They sat quietly, their expressions steeped in remorse, hands clasped, eyes lowered, but listening. And then Malik did something that stunned even them. He nodded, just slightly, in their direction. A simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had hoped for and feared they didn't deserve. Forgiveness. "I choose to forgive those who hurt me," Malik continued. "Not because what they did was okay, but because I refuse to carry the weight of resentment. That burden is too heavy, and I know that only through forgiveness can real change begin." The auditorium erupted in applause. Some stood, others wiped away tears. Even those who had come just to report the story now felt part of it. At that moment, Derrick Carter rose from his seat and joined his son on stage. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "There was a time I believed justice meant punishment alone. But through what we've lived, I've come to understand, justice without transformation is only half the battle. Stratus Air made a grave mistake, but instead of hiding or folding, they chose the harder road, to own it, to change, and to prove to the world that anyone, any company, any person can become better." He looked over to Edward Langston, the CEO of Stratus Air, sitting in the audience, his eyes misty. Langston gave a respectful nod, silently acknowledging the truth in Derrick's words. Malik stepped forward again, voice now filled with resolve. "My story isn't unique. All around the world, people are denied respect, dignity, fairness, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We all make mistakes, but we can choose to face them, we can fix them, and we can forgive." He paused one last time, then concluded, "I hope my journey reminds us all. Justice isn't the end of something, it's the beginning of something better." Applause roared through the hall, not just for Malik, but for everything he represented: growth, courage, and the bravery it takes to forgive. After the event, Dozens approached Malik and Derrick. Some offered hugs, others simply said thank you. Even Clark, Elena, and Mitchell stepped forward. Malik met each of them with calm eyes and a quiet nod. No bitterness, just acknowledgement and hope. Clark Benson would go on to become an advisor in ethics and policy reform. Elena Brooks continued her work with youth organizations, educating flight staff and customer service teams across industries. Captain Mitchell, retired from flying, became a mentor for aspiring pilots, teaching them that the sky demands more than skill. It demands character. And Stratus Air, once on the brink of collapse, was now a global symbol of second chances, not because of one person, but because one person chose not to give up.